Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph L. Graves Jr. I am professor of biological sciences in the Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University. I am a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I'm about to explain to you why humans do not have biological races. Now, I have written about this in a number of books beginning in the 1990s. My first book, The Emperor's New Clothes, was published in 2001. It's a history of racial thinking in the Western world. The second book, The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, explains how people continue to make mistakes when they believe that humans have biological races and the problems that causes. And finally, a book written with my good colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman, a former president of the American Anthropological Association, Racism Not Race, which was published in 2022. This book was in question and answer format because we felt it was necessary to help people work through these misconceptions regarding human biological variation and the idea of race. Now, since this is a biology class, I want to remind you about how biological organisms are now classified in the 21st century. We begin with the domain. For example, eukarya represents those organisms that have complex cell types. Kingdom Animalia, those that have muscles and nerves. Class mammals, those that feed their young utilizing milk. Order primates, those that have stereoscopic vision and an opposable thumb. Family Hominidae, which is characterized by walking upright and having a large brain capacity and tool making. And finally, the genus Homo. Now, for those of you who are unaware, there have been at least 8 intelligent hominid species that lived on this planet. Some of them lived on the planet at the same time we did. However, all of those other species of hominids have gone extinct, and our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, is the only one that remains. Now, the species level is biologically real in that it is defined by the ability of individuals within that group to mate and produce fertile offspring. All of the other categories have some degree of arbitrariness with regard to which organisms are included in and out of those categories, specifically those that exist below the species level, such as subspecies or geographical races. These decision to classify individuals within these groups can be somewhat arbitrary. Now, I want to point out to you that our species, anatomically modern humans, as I'm about to demonstrate to you, does not actually have any biological races. However, we have used some arbitrary traits to define which groups of people belong to supposed racial groups. One of them is skin color. Skin color only represents 5 of approximately 19,000 protein coding genes. So it's an incredibly small amount of our genome, but yet has held a great deal of significance in regard to our social history. Now, I want to quickly point out to you that biological definitions of race have changed with the history of biology. And this is something that generally is not well known, certainly isn't taught in most high schools and even in many university courses. So the first 2 sets of criteria for defining biological races are actually associated with Christian special creationism in the Western world. In fact, had nothing to do with science as we currently know it in the 21st century. So those first criteria, called essentialist or taxonomic criteria, had mainly to do with the physical attributes of the organisms in question. The population and lineage definitions, biological definitions of race, are actually products of the 20th century, and they occurred after the growth of biology as a scientific discipline and are somewhat really different from those earlier ideas. So in the 21st century, only the population and lineage definitions remain relevant to discussions of race in modern biology. Now, I also want to point out that this concept can apply to any species, not just humans. So that's why I want you to understand that the biological race concept, which can apply to any species, is different from the socially defined race concept. This concept uses a combination of physical traits, culture, language, and religion, but only does so in the service of social dominance hierarchies. And it only comes into existence with regard to humans. In other words, this idea was part of the expansion of Western society through colonialism and slavery to justify who had rights as a human being and who did not. Now, quickly to explain the biological species concept. Now, using modern evolutionary methods, species form through some kind of geographical barrier which prevents gene flow between populations, meaning prevents individuals from migrating back and forth, such that over time, natural selection and genetic drift change the gene frequencies in those populations, allowing them to eventually form new species. Now, in the case of our species, anatomically modern humans, we migrated around the globe after the last ice age began to recede. Now, this is important because our species first evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. For the first 200,000 years, all modern humans lived in Africa. Now, as I said, there were other intelligent hominid organisms in other parts of the world, particularly in Eurasia and Southern Europe and Asia as well. But those species went extinct. Our species did not migrate out of Africa until climatic changes resulting from the recession of the ice sheets occurred, opening migratory paths out of Africa. Now, by the time this occurred, humans were found in the Middle East. The next place we see modern humans is in Southeast Asia and Australia. Then humans move into Europe. Another group of humans from originating in Southeast Asia moves into the region of the world that we know today as Siberia or Beringia. At some point around 12,000 years ago, some humans migrate into the Western Hemisphere. And I want to point out to you that since this occurred through the Arctic, these are actually very short distances. So you're looking at a Mercator projection, which is turning a globe into a flat surface. And so these distances, particularly at the poles, are exaggerated. So this actually wasn't that long or distant migration from Beringia into North America. And eventually humans established themselves in the Western Hemisphere. The last place that we know that humans established themselves is in the Pacific Islanders, which only occurred around on the order of 3,000 years ago. Now, how do we know that humans first originated in Africa? Well, the first is the fact that all of the most ancient fossils of anatomically modern humans are found in Africa on the order of 300,000 years ago. No fossils of our species are found outside of Africa until around 100,000 years ago. Now, if fossils were the only bit of evidence we have, you could make the argument, well, because it's difficult to find fossils, maybe the out of Africa explanation for human migration isn't correct. Well, it turns out that we have three other means of demonstrating that humans must have first evolved in Africa. The first method is mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited from mothers to daughters and provides a complete lineage back through time to where our species originated. So, using modern phylogenetic techniques, we can show that all of the mitochondrial DNAs that exist on this planet are derived from the ones that first appear in Africa. So looking at this graph or this diagram, you can see that the bright red mitochondrial DNA sequences appear in Africa. All of the others, which are derived from those African mitochondrial DNAs, okay, are traced back to the red ones in Africa. Now, in addition to that, we can show using Y chromosomes, which are inherited from fathers to sons, the same pattern of African origin. So in this diagram, you can see again a tree of relatedness of all of the Y chromosomes that exist in modern people. And the blue one, D0, represents the most ancient of those lineages. And it is all the others, okay, are derived from this original blue one. So we now have three sets of independent evidence: fossils, mitochondrial DNA, and also Y chromosome DNA. Finally, we can also show, looking at the entire genome, that the heterozygosity of populations declines with linear distance from Africa. Now, for those of you that have taken genetics, you know that heterozygosity results when an individual receives a given gene from their mother and another gene from their father that aren't the same. So the more genetic diversity you have in a population, the greater the amount of heterozygosity. Since humans first evolved in Africa, they accumulated the greatest amount of genetic variability. And as people left Africa in small groups, they lost genetic variability by chance, hence leaving us a linear pattern of migration away from the African continent. In addition, another genetic phenomenon known as linkage disequilibrium, which refers to the size of different genetic markers relative to each other that results from crossing over, that is, the recombination of chromosomes, increases away from Africa. Now, since crossing over reduces these linkage blocks, the longer a population has been in existence, the smaller its linkage blocks. The more recent populations have bigger linkage blocks. And again, we see a linear increase away from Africa, where humans first evolved. So these four sets of independent evidence demonstrate conclusively that humans first evolved on the continent of Africa. Now, during that migration, did we form racial groups based upon the modern biological definitions? And the answer is no. That migration begins out of Africa around 100,000 years ago, as shown here. And as you can see, based upon the width of these lineages, the vast majority of genetic variation within our species still resides amongst Africans. The populations that leave essentially lose genetic variation, but don't actually ever become biological races in the sense of there being a reduction in gene flow. Now, this doesn't mean that humans didn't adapt to the environments in which they came to colonize during this migratory journey around the globe, which we certainly did. Now, the kinds of traits for which we have really strong evidence that resulted from this migratory journey are not the ones that most people would think of. Some of them, however, are somewhat obvious. As humans moved across the planet, they came in contact with new diseases. So one of the strongest sets of evidence for adaptation is resistance to diseases like malaria. Now, this occurs not just in Africa, because malaria-bearing mosquitoes appear all over the globe. It occurs in Southern Europe, in Spain, in the Middle East, in Greece, in India. So all of these adaptations, for example, the one that's well known is sickle cell anemia, appears in all of these populations. Another example is lactase persistence. Since mammals usually shut off their lactase enzyme after their young are weaned, the only humans who have the ability to continue to digest lactase after weaning are those that domesticated cattle. But that happened in Africa, it happened in the Middle East, it happened in Northern Europe, and so on. So despite the fact that we have regionally specific genetic adaptations, these don't represent enough genetic variability to define or to characterize human beings as being racial groups. Now, one good example of this is skin color, which we started this conversation on. Skin color intensity is related directly, or skin color is directly related to solar intensity. So in the tropics, populations that evolved there have darker skin than those who evolved in the temperate zones. Now, since our migratory path was from Africa through the Indian subcontinent into Australia, the first migrations stayed within the tropics, and those people still have dark skin. Later on, people began to migrate into the temperate zones and began to lose darker skin as an adaptation to less solar intensity. Those are the individuals who crossed into the Western Hemisphere and are now only beginning to re-evolve darker skin in the tropics. Now, this graph shows you a more accurate representation of the sizes of the land masses for which humans migrated. And again, this you can see is very different from the Mercator projection that you saw earlier in this talk. And you can see that Africa passes through the largest amount of latitude compared to any other landmass on the planet. And hence there's more diversity in skin tone on the continent of Africa than there is anywhere else. Now, as people migrated into the temperate zones, it took them a while before they evolved lighter skin. For example, this site found a young skeleton of a young boy in northern Spain. It's dated to around 7,000 years ago. But what's really interesting about this individual's genes, because they were able to extract the DNA and sequence it, is that while the individual had derived genes for other traits that were different from the tropics, they still retained the genes for skin pigmentation, which are found in the tropics, indicating that this individual 7,000 years ago in northern Spain still had dark skin. And so we also know that skin color is independent from variation in hair color. So these two individuals pictured here are both blonde-haired persons, but their blonde hair results from different genes. One mutation that's found in Northern Europe and another that's found in Melanesia. The Melanesian one, by the way, is older. That is, the blonde hair mutation in Melanesia is actually older than the one in Europe. So once again, physical traits don't allow us to be able to define people as belonging to different supposed biological races. So at the end of the day, biological criteria for race fail in human beings. Even though we can look at humans from around the globe, we can see that they have different physical traits, but these different physical traits aren't enough to characterize people as being different biological races. And the criteria we use now in the 20th century to define race in any species are how much variation exists within that species, within a given group versus between them, and whether any group can be considered a unique genetic or evolutionary lineage. In humans, there's more genetic variation within each group than there is between them, meaning that they're really not groups. There are no unique genetic lineages in humans either, because during our migration around the globe, gene flow between groups, regional groups, was always high enough to allow us not to strongly differentiate. So, why then are people described as being members of different races? These are entirely the result of social conventions and not biology. Now, these social definitions are flexible. They are dependent upon culture and history. For example, the largest number of people in the transatlantic slave trade were brought to Brazil, not to North America. And in 1995, people in Brazil self-identified in 15 different racial categories. Most of those Brazilian categories would be called Black in the United States. However, to Brazilians, those categories have cultural significance different from the way we have defined race in the United States. Now, it turns out that the current government, following US practice, is now trying to collapse those 15 categories into 4. In other words, in Brazil, they're going to start categorizing people as white, brown, black, or yellow. Again, these are not biologically based, they're socially based. Now, here you can see a table showing the different social race categories that were used in the United States on the census between 1790 and 2000. And as you read through them, you can see that these categories change depending upon the historical period. Now, Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Management and Budget from the Presidents recognizes that these categories are not biological. In fact, they say so. The census literally states that these categories are not biological, nor are they scientific. So recently, the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the most august scientific groups in the world, put together a special commission to change the way populations are described in human genetics research. I testified before that committee on April 4th of last year and started out my comment with this statement. Our social conceptions of race and ethnicity do not match the underlying biological and genetic variation within our species. And we should never confuse the things that were created for the purpose of oppressing people with the nature of that biological and genetic variation. Now, I thank you for your attention to my lecture, and my books give more detail for those of you that are interested in learning more. Thank you.